There's a policy in California prisons called the hands-off policy. What it means is that if you have a problem with somebody in prison, they disrespected you, or you just need to make a point, and you want to get up on them and teach them a lesson, knock them to the ground, show who's the big man because your feelings are hurt, you can't. Hands off. The reason for this is that whenever you knock this dude to the ground and start beating him up to make your point, the gunner up in the tower is going to start yelling, "Get down, get down, get down!" And he's going to come up on that window and he's going to level the Mini 14 at you. He very well may take your life. He'll fire that gun. It could kill you. The bigger concern is it could kill the guy standing behind you, the guy that had nothing to do with you having your feelings hurt. It's just too serious of an environment. The consequences are too dire to accept that guys are going to start having little fistfights over every stupid thing. If you got a problem with somebody, you bring it to your shot caller, you tell him what the issue is, and it gets dealt with by the shot caller, or not at all. I had a cellie shortly after I rolled up named Jimmy. Jimmy had been a member of the Norteño prison gang. He felt seriously enough about this policy, this hands-off policy, that whenever he and his cellie had violated it, they got into a fight in the cell and they lied to the members of their gang about what had happened. Jimmy said his black eye was from falling over, or whatever he said. And it became clear that people didn't believe him, that it was likely that Jimmy was going to be disciplined in some manner by his gang for fighting with another member of his gang. He rolled up. He left the gang and entered the sensitive needs program. He went PC, it's called. Knowing what I know about Jimmy, I think he probably blew the entire situation up in his mind to a much bigger deal than it was. And that whatever fight he got into with his cellie, I bet he was 100% at fault. But the point is that he felt seriously enough about this policy and the consequences of violating it that he left the gang he was in. On the sensitive needs side of the prison, the PC part where guys leave after they leave their gangs, there's still a intrinsic need to try and hide the fact you were in a fight. Now from the other inmates, you get into a fight with somebody and nobody cares. Maybe his friends will jump in or your friends will jump in, but it's just the Wild West. There's no set of rules that everybody has to abide by. Still, if the administration finds out that you were fighting, there are consequences for it. So whether you were fighting with your friend or your mortal enemy, it's quite reasonable that at the end of the day, the two of you are going to conspire to try and hide the fact that you were in a fight. You might have your friends bring you food in the cell so that you don't have to go to meals for a couple of days because you have a big black eye and you can't think of a way to hide it. Or you might wear your clothes a little differently, wear a long sleeve shirt or take a beanie and pull it down over your face a little bit more than you have to cover the bruising. While I was incarcerated at SADF on E-Yard, a couple of weeks before the thing with the professor and the freezers where we were trying to get millionaire music producer Phil Spector to purchase freezers for the inmate body, I'd had an interesting occurrence. An acquaintance of mine, Brandon, had approached me in the day room and, "Hey Aaron, come here, let me get at you for a minute." He knew that I knew some things about medicine. I had the perception of knowing a lot on the subject because I had a couple of textbooks that my father-in-law, who was a physician, had sent me. Most notably, I had a textbook on communicable diseases and the common methods of transmission, which I was always happy to lend to anybody who was interested. Because whether it was HIV or MRSA or anything like that that could easily be transmitted from one inmate to another, well, it was in everybody's best interest if everybody was educated on these things. There will be less communicable disease. Everybody will be safer. The question Brandon had for me had nothing to do with communicable diseases. He approached me and he got my attention and pulled up his sleeve. He had the gnarliest, nastiest bite mark imaginable on his arm. It was still fresh. It was oozing, barely crusted over, and it looked like whoever had bit into him had got all the way down into the meat and just not let go. You could count teeth on this thing. He explained that his cellie and himself had gotten into a little tussle, and he tried to put his cellie into a headlock, and the guy just bit down on his bicep and wouldn't let go. They'd ended up in a strange stalemate where he was binking the guy on the back of the head, trying to get him to let go, and the guy was tearing at his bicep. They ended up calling it a draw and retreating to their separate corners of the cell. The fight was over. His cellie, Shadow, nursed a concussion, I'm sure, and Brandon tried to figure out a way to wash out his arm and came to me and explained what had happened, hoping I might have some information. The fact of the matter is, the human mouth is just the nastiest place for bacteria as far as this is concerned. And it's very easy to get a brutal infection from a bite mark. I explained this to Brandon, and I gave him the best advice I could. I imagine it's what just about anybody would have told him. Abrade it the best you can, get in there, really clean it out, take a long time abrading it and scrubbing it raw, and then just wash it out and keep it clean, keep it dry, change the dressing daily. This had been about 2 weeks before the weekend in which I started having problems with my cellie. On this evening, Brandon approached me, and I was most interested in, hey, how's the bite healing? It's been a couple of weeks since I talked to you about that. He was stressed, concerned, a little furtive, looking around like he had a secret. I asked him, man, what's going on? You seem tense. He showed me the bite, and it was healing fine, but that wasn't his topic. He let me know that my cellie, AJ, had apparently spoken to his cellie, Shadow. Told him that he was tired of listening to me snore and was likely to take flight on me in the next couple of days, might be going to the hole. I don't snore like a normal person. It's not just an easy little every once in a while, or the cartoon bear going hum num num num. I snore loudly and aggressively. I have sleep apnea and a very severe case. This means that I stop breathing in my sleep occasionally, sometimes for as much as a minute at a time. Whenever I resume breathing, it is a loud and aggressive snort, choking sound, which is essentially me starting breathing again. I almost died. The only reason this is relevant is because AJ had decided that he was done putting up with this. He and I had been having problems. He'd went and told Shadow he was going to end up getting into a fight with me that next day or two, and, well, see you whenever I get out of the hole, I guess. Shadow had told Brandon. I think everybody involved thought that I was going to be very concerned about this, that it was a serious issue, and I was pretty blasé on the topic. Brandon asked, what's wrong? Aren't you worried about this? And I explained to him that no, I really wasn't worried that AJ was going to take off on me. For starters, he wasn't the type. I've described him as a snake and a sneak thief, and I think that is an accurate description. He was a coward. I suppose that if the circumstances warranted it, he would have snuck up behind me and hit me in the head with something if he had to. But the idea of a heads-up fight, and especially the idea that he was going to get involved in any kind of physical confrontation where he didn't have to just because he was annoyed or frustrated, I didn't believe it. I told Brandon that I thought that what was going on was that AJ was trying to leverage me out of the cell. It wasn't a coincidence that he'd went and told my friend and then his cellie and people about maybe getting into a fight. If he really wanted to get into a fight, he would have kept the information to himself and just done something. No, he was trying to intimidate me. He knew this information to get back to me. And hopefully I'd move out of the cell. Maybe I'd go tell the cops I couldn't be there anymore and they needed to help me. Or even if I just went and told him, I don't want to live with you anymore, I'm a little bit scared, I'll find someplace else to go, it would give him a stronger bargaining position because we lived in a good cell. And that way he wouldn't have to move out, I would. Essentially, this was a good plan But what he wasn't counting for was that the CPAP machine that I had had prescribed to me because of my sleep apnea, this is an assistive breathing device which you wear while you're asleep to prevent yourself from dying in your sleep because you don't breathe. It required that I be housed where I was, on a lower bunk. I wasn't the guy that was going to be moving out of the cell if we all approached the cops and said, we're not getting along, we need to do some moves. He was the guy that was going to get moved out of the cell. I expect his plan had been that he and Shadow would end up celled together on the upper tier where we were, and then I'd move in with Brandon because he knew that I got along with the guy reasonably well. This is pretty close to what happened at the end of the day, but I want to pause here and give two small details about Brandon. One regards a disease that I caught while I was incarcerated. Valley fever. It's also called coccidioidomycosis. It is a fungal infection which routinely settles in the lungs and can be quite dangerous. I didn't get it in my lungs. I had an unusual presentation. Over the course of about 2 weeks, my hands turned into claws, and I couldn't use them. I couldn't open a soda. I couldn't write with a pen. I couldn't type. It was really painful, one of the more painful experiences of my life. My hands I didn't have them anymore. In this time period, I had a very difficult time eating my dinners. I was a part of the kosher meals program, and they served us TV dinners. You had to remove a plastic film off the top of the tray like you do with a Hungry Man dinner or anything like it. I lacked the manual dexterity. It hurt too bad. I tried, and I just couldn't get the top off of these meals. Brandon saw that I was having a hard time. For the 2 or maybe 3 weeks that I really was symptomatic with this illness, he walked with me every meal, opened up my dinner, laid it out on the tray, made sure everything was okay. I didn't need him to do anything ridiculous like feed me, but I got the feeling the dude was there to help whatever it was I needed. He barely knew me at the time. It stood out as a decent thing that he did for somebody that he didn't have to do. And that's a nice story. There's another fact that I want to toss in about Brandon. You see, I had a thing that I did occasionally where I'd ask people, so the thing you're in for, and you don't need to tell me what it is, I don't care, but I'm just curious. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad do you think it was? You know, is it a 10, the worst thing imaginable, or was it a 6? You know, it's pretty bad, but people tended to mitigate. Almost always, people would say 6, 7, or 8 for how bad it was. You know, it's bad, they went to prison for it, but even if somebody killed somebody, they were always clear that, well, it just wasn't that bad because I didn't mean to do it, or I was really high when I did it, I wasn't in my right mind. Very rarely did somebody take full accountability, go, that thing I did was a 10. And then I'd follow up with, okay, so the thing you did, it was a 7 or an 8 or whatever they said. How harshly do you feel you were punished by the state? Do you think that you got a reasonable punishment? It's a 6 right along with the 6 that you committed? Or do you think it's way too little? They only gave you a little bit of time and you did something awful. They gave you a 4 and you did a 6. Or did they break you off? Did they ruin your life? You got a 10 as harsh as the punishment is. Pretty standard. People would say that they'd done a 6, a 7, or an 8 on how bad it was, and that the punishment was a 9 or a 10, that they were being way harshly punished. Ruined their lives, took their freedom from them, however they expressed it. I asked Brandon this before I knew what he was in for. What'd you do? How bad was it? And do you feel you were punished appropriately? He was one of the very few people that I met who said what I did was a 10. It was evil. There is no mitigation for it, and I make no excuses for it. And the punishment I'm receiving? It's a 7 or an 8. They didn't execute me over it. They didn't torture me over it. I'm never getting out of prison. I found out Brandon was serving a lengthy life sentence. He'll die in prison. But he was acceptant of that, or at least seemed to be. I found out later that the crime he was in for was of a sexual nature. He was a rapist. There is no mitigation for that. It is so nasty and abhorrent. The reason I paused for these two details is that I ended up living with Brandon. He was my cellie, and in the next couple of videos, we'll talk about him occasionally. I just needed to provide some explanation as to how and why I end up living with somebody like that. I had little choice in the matter, but even now, 15 years later, I look back and it's an uncomfortable reality that I was friendly with somebody like that because of the abhorrent and unforgivable nature of doing that to anybody. The thing that I wanted to talk about today, not just the story about my cellie AJ somehow manipulating a situation to try and get me moved out, was how there are rarely simple answers to complex questions, talking about the nature of a person, whether somebody can be rehabilitated, can be changed in prison. I honestly don't know. And I don't know, after having spent almost 20 years locked up with some of the nastiest people alive, many of whom seem to be sincerely trying to change themselves. Can a tiger change its stripes? There isn't a simple answer to that question. So, in your everyday life, if you find yourself looking for easy answers to complex questions, is this guy a good person or a bad person? Am I happy or sad? Well, remind yourself that sometimes it is so much more complex than that. Thank you for listening today.